She never imagined that her life would change in an instant, but that day everything she knew was shattered. It started like any other morning. She woke up to the soft light of the sun creeping through the curtains, the warmth of the early hours filling the room. Everything felt calm, normal, predictable. There was nothing special about that morning. She stretched lazily in bed, trying to shake off the remnants of a dream that felt distant already. Her son, Noah, was still asleep in his room, and her husband, Michael, was likely still in the shower. The house was quiet, peaceful, just how she liked it. She made her way to the kitchen to start preparing breakfast, thinking about the little things she'd need to do that day. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then the phone rang. It wasn't the usual time for anyone to call, especially not on a weekend, so it caught her off guard. She picked up the phone expecting to hear the voice of one of her friends or a neighbor needing something. Instead, what she heard on the other end of the line made her stomach drop. The voice on the other side was soft, small, and filled with a kind of fear she hadn't ever heard in her son's voice. It took a moment for her brain to catch up, but then the words hit her with the force of a freight train. "Mom, Dad's on the floor. He won't wake up." It took a few moments for her to process what she had just heard. Her mind raced, her breath became shallow. She tried to stay calm, but the sheer terror in her son's voice was unmistakable. Noah was only 6 years old. He didn't know how to explain things properly, and the gravity of what he was saying was slowly sinking in. "What do you mean, Noah?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happened?" But he couldn't explain it any better. All she could make out was that Michael was lying on the floor, unresponsive, and he couldn't wake him up. Panic started to rise in her chest, but she knew she had to stay focused. She told Noah to stay where he was and to stay on the phone while she tried to make sense of the situation. She tried to think clearly, but nothing made sense. She hung up and grabbed her keys, running out of the house, not thinking about what to do next, just knowing she had to get to her son. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she rushed to the car. Every second felt like an eternity as she drove through the streets, every intersection a blur. The air around her was thick, and she could barely hear the sound of the engine over the chaos in her mind. She had no idea what awaited her at home, but she felt something deep in her gut. Something was terribly wrong. And she had no idea just how wrong it was until she walked through that door. When she finally got home, she was barely able to breathe. The house, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a foreign and frightening place. Her hands shook as she grabbed the door handle, pushing it open. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was too quiet, a stark contrast to the usual sounds of life at home. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the wooden floors beneath her feet, and the occasional rustle from Noah's toys scattered around the house. But today there was none of that. The house was still, eerily still. Her feet moved instinctively as she rushed toward Noah's room, but when she got there, she stopped dead in her tracks. He wasn't in his room. He wasn't in the living room either. She called his name, but no answer came. Her heart skipped a beat. Panic began to rise again, more intense this time. Had something happened to him too? Was he okay? Her mind was running wild with every possible scenario, none of them good. She ran to the kitchen hoping to find Noah there, but the moment she stepped into the doorway, she saw him. He was sitting on the kitchen floor, his back against the refrigerator, staring blankly ahead. His tiny body was trembling. It was as if he had been frozen in place, and as soon as he saw her, he looked up, his eyes wide and filled with a mix of confusion and fear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice so small it broke her heart. I couldn't wake him up. She rushed to him, her legs weak, and scooped him into her arms, holding him close. He felt so small, so fragile in her arms. Her mind was racing again, but she couldn't afford to let fear take over. She had to stay focused. "Where's Dad, baby?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Noah looked up at her with a blank expression and pointed toward the living room. She followed his gaze, and it was then that she saw it. Michael was lying on the floor, his body unnaturally still, face pale, eyes wide open but vacant. It was the most horrifying thing she had ever seen. She felt the floor shift beneath her, as if the world had tilted on its axis. Her husband, the man she loved, was lying there motionless. Without thinking, she rushed to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She kneeled beside him, pressing her fingers to his wrist, searching for any sign of life. Her hands were trembling, but she couldn't stop them. His pulse was weak, barely there. She could feel the air in her lungs becoming tighter, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't understand it. How could this be happening? It didn't make sense. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind. Should she try CPR? Should she call for help? What was happening? All she could hear in that moment was the sound of her own breathing and the thudding of her heart, drowning out everything else. The world around her seemed to shrink until there was nothing but Michael on the floor and Noah, who was still clinging to her, frightened, confused. She pulled herself together, forcing her mind to clear, and grabbed her phone. She dialed 911 with hands that didn't feel like her own. "Help," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My husband, he's not breathing. Please, you have to come. He's not waking up." The seconds felt like hours as she held Noah tightly in her arms, trying to comfort him, though she knew there was nothing she could do to ease his terror. He kept asking where his dad was. Why wasn't he waking up? And all she could do was hold him close and promise that everything would be okay, even though she didn't know if it would be. The 911 operator was calm and collected on the other end of the line, guiding her through what to do while they sent help. But her mind was numb and everything felt so distant, like she was moving through a dream that she couldn't wake up from. The sounds around her were muffled and she couldn't focus on the operator's voice despite her best efforts. She just kept looking at Michael's body, willing him to move, to show any sign that he was still alive. But there was nothing. It was as though the man she had known for so long, the man who had shared her life and built their family together, was gone in an instant, and she was left here, in this silent, empty house with nothing but a small child who didn't fully understand what was happening. She felt like she was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on her. The only thing keeping her grounded was Noah's steady breathing in her arms, a reminder that he was still here, that he still needed her. She couldn't break down now. As she waited for the police and paramedics to arrive, she kept thinking back to all the times she had imagined what it would be like if something happened to Michael. But none of those thoughts prepared her for this. She had never thought it would happen so suddenly, so violently. She had never thought it would happen like this. The sound of sirens finally broke through her daze. The paramedics rushed into the house, and for a brief moment, she stepped aside as they took over. They worked quickly, checking Michael for signs of life, attaching machines to him, but it was clear that nothing was going to bring him back. One of the paramedics gently touched her arm and gave her a look that told her everything she didn't want to know. Her husband was gone. She collapsed to the ground, clutching Noah even tighter, as if holding him would stop the world from spinning out of control. In that moment, everything she had built her life on, everything that had felt so secure, seemed to crumble to dust. Michael was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces, trying to hold on to the one thing that mattered most: Noah. The paramedics were doing their best, but nothing could change the reality of the situation. And as she sat there, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of it all, the detectives arrived. She barely registered their presence, her mind still reeling. They started asking questions, their voices sharp as they began to piece together what had happened. It felt surreal, like she was watching it all unfold from a distance, detached from the rawness of it. The questions kept coming, but all she could do was nod, barely able to focus on anything other than Noah. She needed to keep him safe, keep him close, because he was all that was left now. He was the only thing that mattered. The investigation into what had happened to Michael started almost immediately. The detectives were quick to secure the scene, their presence overwhelming as they moved around the house, asking questions and taking notes. But the only thing that kept her grounded, the only thing that kept her from losing herself in the chaos, was Noah. He was still clinging to her, his small hands gripping her shirt tightly, his face pale and filled with confusion. She didn't have the answers he was asking, but she couldn't afford to break down in front of him. She needed to be strong for him, no matter how much her own heart was breaking. As they sat in the living room, the detectives continued their questioning, and she did her best to give them what they needed, though her mind was scattered. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Her memories of the morning felt fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. She kept thinking about Michael, how he had been there just hours before, how he had been fine, how they had talked about their plans for the weekend. And now, here she was, sitting in a house that was no longer hers, trying to make sense of a reality that didn't seem real. The detectives were kind but persistent. They wanted to know everything, every detail, every movement. Who had been in the house? Who could have done this to Michael? Her head was spinning as she tried to recall the events leading up to the moment she had found him on the floor, lifeless. And then, the name came up. It wasn't one she had heard in years. It was Victoria, a name from Michael's past. The detectives seemed to know who she was. They said it was important to their investigation. Victoria had been involved with Michael years ago, but as far as Emma knew, that chapter was long closed. She didn't know much about her, but she knew enough to be uncomfortable with the thought of her. Victoria was someone who had caused some trouble in Michael's life, someone he had tried to distance himself from. But Emma didn't know the full story. The detectives told her they had found evidence of Victoria being in the house recently, and that it wasn't the first time she had shown up. They mentioned that she had been leaving signs of her presence, small things that only someone who had been watching them closely could have known. The feeling of dread that had been simmering in Emma's chest intensified. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep in her bones. Victoria had been in their lives for longer than she realized, and now, she was starting to see how dangerous that could have been. The detectives were doing their best to reassure her, telling her they would get to the bottom of it, that they would find the person responsible for what happened to Michael. But Emma couldn't focus on them. Her mind kept going back to Noah. He needed her. He was scared, and she couldn't help but feel that something even worse was coming for him. That was the moment she realized. Her fight wasn't just to understand what had happened. It was to keep Noah safe, because whoever had taken Michael from her wasn't going to stop there. She had to protect him no matter what. The phone call came in the dead of night, just as Emma was about to drift off into a restless sleep. The sound of the ring shattered the stillness, making her heart race. She reached for the phone with shaky hands, her mind already racing with the worst possible scenarios. She hadn't been able to sleep properly since Michael's death, and every little noise made her jump. It was a police officer, her voice urgent. "Ma'am, we need you to come down to the station immediately. There's been a development in your husband's case." Emma's stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She didn't know what to think, but she knew that she couldn't stay in that house any longer, not with the constant fear and uncertainty hanging over them. She got up, grabbed her coat, and went straight to the police station, her mind consumed by 1,000 thoughts. What did they know? Had they found something? When she arrived, the officers were already waiting for her, their expressions serious. Detective Brooks, the lead investigator, was the one who met her at the door. He looked tired, his face drawn and weary. "We need to talk about Victoria," he said, his voice low. Emma's heart skipped a beat. They had mentioned her name before, but nothing had prepared her for what he said next. "We found her. We have reason to believe she's been watching your family for a lot longer than we thought. She's been in your house more times than you realized. And there's more. We have reason to believe she may be involved in something even darker." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected something wasn't right, but to hear it confirmed was another thing entirely. The police had discovered a series of disturbing details that pointed to Victoria's deep obsession with Michael and their family. Evidence showed that she had been following them, watching them from the shadows, and even planting items around their house to keep tabs on them. It was clear now that her obsession had only grown stronger over time. She had been stalking them for months, maybe even years. And what was worse, the police had found a link between Victoria and a possible accomplice, a woman who had been posing as a nurse, helping Emma during her recovery in the hospital. The woman had been using a fake identity. It wasn't Victoria's first attempt to get close to the family. Emma felt the ground beneath her feet shift. She was trapped in a nightmare she didn't know how to escape. The police had no answers, only more questions. The detective's words echoed in her mind. "We need to find her, she's not done yet." And that was when it hit her, the realization that this nightmare was far from over. Victoria wasn't finished, and she would stop at nothing to get what she believed she deserved. The next few days passed in a blur, each one heavier than the last. Emma couldn't escape the thought of Victoria, the woman who had slowly infiltrated their lives, who had managed to deceive her at every turn. The more she learned about Victoria's past, the more it felt like they had been living in a house of lies. Emma had trusted people, trusted that the people around her were who they said they were. But now, that trust had been shattered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victoria's face, heard her voice, felt her presence lurking in the shadows. It was a constant battle to keep her fears in check, to keep the terror from consuming her. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, constantly on edge, unable to relax. Her thoughts were always consumed by one question. Why? Why had this happened to them? What had she done to deserve this? What had Michael done? Why had Victoria chosen their family to torment? Every part of Emma wanted to know the truth, but the more she uncovered, the more questions she had. It seemed like there was no end to the mystery, no clear path to safety. Detective Brooks had been working tirelessly, tracking down every lead, trying to piece together the puzzle. But they were always just one step behind Victoria. It felt like Victoria was always in control, always a move ahead. Emma began to lose hope that they would ever catch her, that they would ever be safe again. But then everything changed in a single moment. She had just gotten home from another round of interviews with the police when she noticed something strange. Noah was playing outside in the yard. It wasn't like him to wander off by himself, and it immediately set her nerves on edge. She walked toward the window, trying to get a better look at him, but something in her gut told her that something wasn't right. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw him standing at the edge of the yard, talking to someone. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized who it was. Victoria, the woman who had been haunting her thoughts, the woman who had been causing her family so much pain, was standing there in broad daylight, speaking to her son. Emma's mind raced as she felt her body freeze in fear. She didn't know how to react, she didn't know what to do. The only thing she could think of was that she had to protect Noah. She ran outside, screaming his name, but as she did, she saw Victoria's face twist into a malicious smile. The smile was the same one she had seen in her nightmares, the smile of someone who believed they were entitled to take everything from her. "Noah, come here!" Emma shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Noah turned, and for a moment Emma saw the fear in his eyes. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew enough to be scared. As soon as he started running toward her, Victoria turned and fled into the trees at the edge of their property. Emma ran after her, but it was too late. Victoria had already disappeared into the woods, leaving Emma standing there with her heart pounding in her chest, her hands shaking with adrenaline. It was the closest she had come to losing Noah, and she knew then that Victoria wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. Emma had never felt so vulnerable, so powerless, but something inside her shifted in that moment. She wasn't going to let Victoria take everything from her. She was going to fight back. She had to. For Noah, for Michael, and for herself. The day finally came when they received the news that Victoria had been captured. Emma felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, but it didn't fully hit her until the moment she saw the look on Noah's face. After everything that had happened, after all the fear, the hiding, the constant tension, they were finally safe. It was a bittersweet victory. Emma couldn't erase the trauma, couldn't fix the hole left in her heart by losing Michael, but she knew that they were taking their first steps toward healing. It wasn't over. Not yet. But it was a start. In the days that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. Noah was struggling, still afraid, still haunted by the memories of what had happened. But Emma held him close, letting him know that they would get through this together. There were still hard days ahead, days when the shadows of the past would creep up on them, but for the first time in a long time, Emma had hope. Hope that she could protect Noah, hope that they could rebuild their lives, and hope that someday she would learn to live with the scars. Victoria's capture didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But Emma was ready for it. She had faced the worst day of her life and she had survived. Now she was determined to make sure that her son had a future free of fear. Every step forward felt like a victory, and with each day the strength she found in herself and in Noah brought them closer to the light at the end of the tunnel. And while she would never forget the pain, she would use it to build a future that was worth fighting for. In that moment, Emma realized something important. Sometimes survival isn't about overcoming every obstacle, but about simply refusing to let the darkness take away what matters most. And as long as she had Noah by her side, she knew she would never give up on them.